So, I've always been interested in urban legends and myths, and in the world of music, there are plenty to go around, with some of them being more believable than others. But the one that I always come back to is about a man named Robert Johnson, who is said to have sold his soul to the devil at the crossroads in exchange for a mastery of the guitar. Now, as far back as I can remember, there's always been a theme in music of artists selling their souls to the devil in exchange for fame and fortune. While I was researching this, I found that the origin of this theme isn't exactly clear because there have been alleged examples of it appearing over 1,000 years ago, with the story of Pope Sylvester II making a deal with a demon. You can go back even further and look at biblical texts, with Jesus being offered different bargains with the devil in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. However, it made its way into the world of music in 1713 when an Italian composer named Giuseppe Tartini woke up from a dream where he had made a pact with the devil for his soul. He described the dream in writing and remembered giving a violin to the devil and hearing him play, and after he woke up, he transposed what he had heard from memory and created the violin sonata in G minor, which later became known as the Devil's Trill Sonata. Fast forward to the early 1900s, and we arrive at one of the largest scale music folktales of all time with Robert Johnson. Before we get into how these stories about Johnson actually started, I think it's important to go over the actual facts of his life first to understand the context about where these stories came from. Up until recently, his history was very poorly documented, which probably contributed to the wildly varying accounts of his life story and caused a lot of people to perpetuate the folktale of his meeting with the devil. Luckily for us, a few researchers like Gail Wardlow and Bruce Conforth, amongst others, invested decades into piecing together information about Johnson and built a somewhat cohesive timeline of events. But even with the extensive research that they did, there are still holes in the story, and a lot of information is through word of mouth, so I'll try to point out when something isn't confirmed. But with that out of the way, let's start at the beginning. Robert Johnson was born in 1911 in the town of Hazelhurst, Mississippi. He was born out of wedlock to Julia Dodds and Noah Johnson, but he never knew his biological father. Sometime after 1911, Julia moved him to Memphis, Tennessee to live with her current husband named Charles Dodds, who she'd married in 1889. Charles was forced to flee Hazelhurst because of a rumor that he had shared a mistress with an Italian farmer and changed his last name to Spencer after settling in Memphis. Now, there are conflicting accounts to how Robert started getting interested in music, but it's most likely that he was introduced to the idea in Memphis from street musicians and clubs in the area. After that, in 1919, he was moved to Lucas, Arkansas by his mother and her new husband named Will Dusty Willis. However, they relocated to the Mississippi Delta near Robinsonville on the Abbey and Leatherman plantation. Now, at some point while he was living in Robinsonville, his mother told him about his birth father Noah Johnson, and sometime after that, he assumed his father's name and started to go by Robert Johnson. This was later confirmed by a marriage certificate that listed Robert Johnson and a girl named Virginia Travis as being married in 1929, so we know he started using the last name sometime before 1929. Virginia Travis died shortly after during childbirth, which was confirmed by her death certificate, which states that she died on April 10th in 1930. During the 30s, he continued playing music, traveling all across the country, and in 1936 and 37, he recorded a total of 29 songs and 13 alternate takes, and they would be the last and only original recordings of Johnson's work to ever exist. Sadly, he would die on August 16, 1938, at the age of 27 years old near Greenwood, Mississippi, of unknown causes at the time, confirmed by his death certificate. That's the most basic timeline of events during his life, and by all accounts, he was an extremely talented blues musician who had a short and tragic life. Now, what took place afterwards and how the legend of his meeting with the devil actually started and spread is one of the most convoluted and absurd things that I have ever read through. A ridiculous amount of people were involved in spreading misinformation, misinterpreting things, and just a whole lot of making shit up. Let's get into how this folktale actually started and try to go over all the possible things that contributed to the story. According to Gail Wardlow, who is one of the researchers investigating Robert Johnson's life, the most likely origin of the legend came shortly after his death in December of 1938. A record producer named John Hammond II was hosting a concert in New York City at Carnegie Hall called From Spirituals to Swing, and one of the artists he had wanted to book for the event was Robert Johnson. In the December 13, 1938 issue of the New Masses magazine, Hammond wrote two things of interest, both of which were false. Firstly, he described Johnson as an unknown hand on a Robinsonville, Mississippi plantation and said that he never believed Johnson was working as a professional musician. Both of these things were incorrect because Johnson was a traveling musician since at least the 1930s, if not earlier, and was paid to play. However, Hammond might not have known that at the time, so his statement could just be him having a lack of information. In the next paragraph, though, he fabricates a tragic story about Johnson's death, saying, "Robert Johnson died last week at the precise moment when the Vocal Lion Scouts finally reached him and told him that he was booked to appear at the Carnegie Hall on December 23rd. In reality, we know Johnson died 4 months earlier in August, and Hammond knew this but said it anyway because it made for a great story. The mysterious persona that Hammond created for Robert piqued the interest of his friend named Alan Lomax. Now, Alan Lomax is a wild character, and I think this quote from an FBI report from 1943 about him says it best. He has a tendency to neglect his work over a period of time, and then just before a deadline, he produces excellent results. Anyway, this guy claims to have met Johnson's mother while searching for information about him in the Mississippi Delta. The problem is, the person who he claims to have talked to was named Mary Johnson and not Julia Dodds. Allen wrote about their encounter in his 1993 book called The Land Where the Blues Began. He claimed that she told him a story about how Johnson gave up his guitar on his deathbed because the Lord showed him it was the devil's instrument with his mother by his side. There's absolutely zero evidence to show that this conversation ever took place, other than a recording from 1962 of Allen recounting the conversation.
But that when he died, he said she came to him, he'd been poisoned.
Oh,
he put his guitar up on the wall and said, "Mama, I passed all that by. Don't worry, I'll meet you in heaven."
So these two people, John Hammond II and Alan Lomax, basically planted the seeds for the tale of Johnson's deal with the devil to slowly develop later on by crafting this patently false, mysterious backstory about him. Now, after 1942, a lot of different things happened, and it's pretty hard to find concrete dates on the order of events and which ones influenced others because documentation was poor back then, so take the timeline with a grain of salt. For most of the early decades after Johnson died, his music was still relatively unknown, but in the 60s it started to get rediscovered and spread around. A lot of people started to misinterpret and write about some of Johnson's lyrics and didn't understand the cultural context of how Delta blues musicians living in the South during the early 1900s would talk about the devil. This brings us to 1959, where a man named Samuel Charters would write a book called The Country Blues. He wrote about a couple of Johnson's songs where he misinterprets lyrics from the songs Hellhound on My Trail and Me and the Devil Blues, and he came away with the conclusion that Johnson was a troubled person and deeply tormented by the devil. By the 60s, a lot more people were aware of Robert Johnson's music because of people like Samuel Charters who had written about him. Fast forward to 1966, and we get to the first ever instance of the actual legend of Johnson's meeting with the devil being recorded in an interview. A man named Pete Welding from Downbeat magazine interviewed Son House, who was a famous Delta blues musician who personally knew Robert Johnson when he was alive. The interview was published in the 1966 yearbook edition of Downbeat magazine on January 1st, 1966. In the interview, Son claimed that Johnson was a poor guitar player and left Robinsonville for 6 months and then came back with an unexplained mastery of the guitar. Son suggests that during his time away, Johnson sold his soul to the devil in exchange for learning to play the guitar like that. Looking at Son's statement closer, there are 3 big problems with it. The first problem being that the first time Son House ever met Robert Johnson was in 1930, but multiple people who knew or lived near Johnson in the 20s claim that he was not only good at playing the guitar by then, but also professionally performing in public by at least 1928. The second problem with this statement is that there's evidence that proves that Johnson was away from Robinsonville for much longer than 6 months. He left Robinsonville sometime in the summer of 1930 to go looking for his father in Hazelhurst, where multiple people confirmed he was living there during that time. There was also a marriage certificate that was discovered before Son House gave this interview that showed Johnson married a girl named Callie Kraft in Hazelhurst on May 4th, 1931, and it was only after he married for a second time claimed that he left to travel back to the Delta. It was confirmed later by a childhood friend of Robert Johnson's named Eula May that he reached the Delta shortly after the start of 1933. The third and most obvious problem is that Johnson didn't magically get better at the guitar. He had a mentor in Hazelhurst named Ike Zimmerman. Ike Zimmerman was an amazing blues guitar player who mentored Johnson for over a couple of years, and Son House knew this because Ike traveled back to Robinsonville with Johnson. One of the best explanations I found for why Son would create a story like this was from Gail Hardlow. It's possible that Son was bitter that a much younger musician who used to learn from him was stealing his guitar playing gigs, and so he downplayed Johnson's skill when retelling the story because he resented Johnson for coming back to Robinsonville playing the guitar better than he could. We can never really know for sure, but it's at least a plausible explanation, and Son House would never repeat this story after this interview for the rest of his life. But the real problem here was not really with Son's story, it was how his words were interpreted later on by journalists and researchers. Most people who looked at this interview took this story literally and again misunderstood how blues musicians in the South talked about the devil with much less seriousness. Sometime later in 1966, a man named David Evans was interviewing people from the Mississippi Delta to collect research for a biography he was writing about Tommy Johnson, who was a famous Delta blues musician. Just to be clear, Tommy Johnson and Robert Johnson are not in any way related, they just happen to have the same last name, which will come into play later on. Anyway, David interviewed Tommy's brother named Liddell Johnson, and a somewhat familiar story came out. Liddell said that Tommy had his guitar tuned by a big black man who supposedly represented the devil at a crossroad near midnight, and that's why he was so good at playing the guitar. Liddell changed his story later on when he was being interviewed by Gail Wardlow, saying that this actually took place in a graveyard on the darkest night of the month. The graveyard detail Liddell changed was probably influenced by Ike Zimmerman's story, since he was known to practice guitar in a graveyard. But the insane part about this is that Robert Johnson also practiced in the same graveyard with Ike because he was his mentor, but Liddell did not know this at the time. Because of the previous stories about Robert Johnson that were fabricated or misconstrued, over time people started to attribute Tommy's story to Robert instead, and this was when the legend of Robert Johnson's deal with the devil really started to spread. From this messy timeline, you can see how easy it is for folktales and legends to quickly get out of hand, because it essentially becomes a multi-decade-long game of telephone where some people slightly change the story on accident while others just make shit up entirely. The Liddell Johnson and Son House stories got repeated multiple times by writers in their books like Mystery Train by Grail Marcus in 1975 and Deep Blues by Robert Palmer in 1981. Except, of course, they didn't just quote the stories, they added their own 2 cents and fully bought into the stories being plausible. Another detail that started getting changed over time was where the actual crossroad was. Back when Liddell originally told the Tommy Johnson story, crossroads were not any specific location, they were just anywhere that 2 roads came together to form a cross. But of course, as the game of telephone kept getting bigger, people started to claim that the legend took place at a specific crossroad. The Dockery Plantation, Hazelhurst, Beauregard, Balua, Clarksdale, and Rosedale have all been mentioned as possible places where the crossroad was. All of this is pretty irrelevant though, because in the original story from Liddell Johnson, the crossroad was just a crossroad somewhere in Mississippi. During the 80s, things started to get crazy, and in 1986, a movie came out called Crossroads that helped push the legend of Robert Johnson into the mainstream and also changed the story again. In Liddell's original story, he referred to a crossroad, but in this movie, it became the crossroads, which is how it's referenced in the modern day. The movie also took details from the 1959 Samuel Charters book I mentioned earlier and perpetuated the myth that there was a secret 30th Robert Johnson song. In the movie, a harmonica player named Willie Brown has sold his soul to the devil, and he tricks a young guitarist named Eugene into taking him to Mississippi with the promise of the 30th missing Robert Johnson song. After Eugene finds out there was no missing song, he then has a literal guitar battle with the devil's ringer to save Willie's soul. The movie uses the phrase inspired by the legend of Robert Johnson, but they basically just made up their own shit and used some real people's names. The real-life Willie Brown was actually a famous Delta blues guitar player who knew Johnson when he was younger, and the secret 30th song was just entirely made up by Samuel Charters. Another movie came out in 1992, which was a documentary called Searching for Robert Johnson. In the documentary, Mac McCormick, who was a folklore researcher, claims that the folktale about Robert Johnson was actually started when Virginia Travis died. He claims that Virginia Travis's family blamed Johnson for her death and said it was because they felt he was an evil musician living a godless lifestyle playing the devil's music, and that Johnson chose to associate himself with the devil's stories after the death of his first wife. Mac McCormick presented this origin story as a fact and gave absolutely no evidence or explanation for how he got this information, and since the documentary came out over 30 years ago, not a single person has found anything to corroborate his story. Since then, the legend has been retold and tweaked countless times, but there's one thing that we didn't cover yet, and that's the story behind Robert Johnson's mysterious death. After he died in 1938, his death wasn't reported publicly, so there was no official story about exactly when or how he died. However, 30 years later, Gail Wardlow found his death certificate, which confirmed the date and location being August 16, 1938 in Greenwood, Mississippi, but in the cause of death section, all that was written was "no doctor." On the back of the certificate, there was a note from the registrar who investigated the death a month after she originally signed the certificate. In the note, she writes that an unnamed plantation owner who was later found out to be a man named Luther Wade says that he thinks Johnson died of syphilis. But later on, new evidence came to light that suggested that Robert Johnson was actually poisoned by a man named Ralph Davis because Johnson had an affair with Ralph's wife. On top of still not knowing exactly how he died, we also don't have definitive proof of where he was buried. However, the most likely location seems to be the cemetery by Little Zion Church under a pecan tree, which is north of Greenwood. This location was corroborated by witness testimony in an interview from Gail Wardlow, who is probably the most trustworthy Robert Johnson researcher. I'm not exactly sure how much influence the circumstances surrounding his death had on the legend itself, but at the very least, it definitely added an additional layer of mystery to his life. I think this story is a perfect example of how urban legends can start, and in the case of Robert Johnson, all it took was one guy lying about the circumstances of his death and exaggerating some details about his life. Over time, it got twisted or lost in translation, and here we are in the modern day where Robert Johnson's deal with the devil is one of the largest scale music legends of all time. Now, I do think it's a bit sad that most people who know him only know about the devil story and his actual life story gets left behind. But at the same time, if the legend never started, his music may have never been rediscovered. Massive names in the music industry like Bob Dylan, Eric Clapton, and Robert Plant from Led Zeppelin have all taken inspiration from his music. Robert Johnson is without a doubt one of the most talented blues musicians in all of history, and he changed music forever even though it happened decades after his death. Thank you guys for watching, stay safe out there, and I'll see you in the next video.